The ice pack was melting against my wrist, dripping slowly onto the arm of the chair, while the house stayed unnaturally quiet. Outside, frost clung to the grass, and the morning light felt too sharp for how tired my body was. My phone kept vibrating on the table, over and over, the same name lighting up the screen. I didn't need to answer to know why he was calling. It wasn't to ask if I was hurt. It never was. If you're watching this and you've ever felt that sinking realization that someone only values what you can give, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. Stories like this happen more often than we admit. I sat there listening to the buzzing stop and start again, realizing this moment wasn't sudden at all. It was the result of years of small compromises I told myself were love. That call was not the beginning of my breaking. It was the proof that it had already happened, long before I was ready to see it. I am 71 years old, and I am sitting alone in my living room with an ice pack pressed against my wrist. The house is silent except for the ticking clock and the slow hum of the heater. Every time I shift in the chair that once belonged to my husband, pain reminds me of what happened 2 nights ago. My phone lights up again on the side table. I do not need to look to know who it is. It is my son. It has been my son every time. The call is not about my bruises or the way my body still feels unsteady, or the fact that I spent part of Christmas Eve on the floor of my own kitchen. What he wants is money. I know that with a clarity that surprises me, even now. After everything, his first instinct is to reach for what I used to give without question. I feel no panic as the phone keeps vibrating, only a dull heaviness and something firmer beneath it. This call is not a misunderstanding. It is a result, a consequence of months, maybe years, of small moments I explained away because facing them felt harder than ignoring them. I sit quietly, realizing this call is the end of something that began long ago now. Before all of that, my life was small in the best possible way. I was 71, retired from my work as a public school librarian, and 5 years into widowhood. My husband's absence was quiet but constant. Like a missing piece of furniture you still walk around without thinking. I lived alone in the house we bought decades ago, and I took pride in keeping it steady. My weeks followed a rhythm that made the days feel anchored. On Wednesdays, I volunteered at the local library, shelving books and helping children find stories they wanted to carry home. Fridays were for book club at a friend's house, always in the early afternoon, always with coffee and something homemade. Those routines gave my time shape and my grief somewhere gentle to rest. My weekends belonged to my son and his wife. I cooked, I listened, I showed up. At the time, it felt like closeness. I noticed, gradually, that conversations turned into requests and concern turned into expectation. When they needed help, I provided it. When they struggled, I softened the edges. I told myself this was love. This was what good mothers did. There were moments of discomfort I brushed aside, small enough to ignore if I kept moving. I chose peace over curiosity, believing harmony mattered more than questions I was afraid to answer. Looking back, I understand how easy it was to mistake silence for stability and generosity for connection, especially when I wanted so badly to believe nothing was wrong. That illusion lasted until one moment. That Friday started like any other, until it didn't. Book club was canceled at the last minute, and by the time I was dressed and ready, the house felt too quiet to return to. I decided to run errands instead. Nothing urgent, just enough to keep the afternoon moving. I drove toward the bank near Willow Park, the one my husband and I had used for years. The parking lot was half full, the kind of ordinary scene you forget as soon as you leave it. As I slowed near the ATM, A bright red coat caught my eye. I recognized it before I recognized the person wearing it. My daughter-in-law. She stood at the machine with her back to me, moving quickly, confidently, as if she had done this many times before. I felt a small tightening in my chest, followed immediately by embarrassment for noticing it all. I told myself there had to be a reason. Families share things. Emergencies happen. I was probably mistaken, but I stayed where I was. I watched as the machine dispensed cash, more than I expected, and she counted it without hesitation before slipping it into her purse. She glanced around once, then walked away. I did not follow her. I sat there longer than necessary, my hands resting on the steering wheel, my pulse uneven. The feeling I had was not anger or fear. It was the same feeling you get when food smells off before you can see it. Subtle. Unmistakable. I drove away knowing I could not ignore it. I went inside the bank that afternoon feeling steadier than I expected. The lobby was familiar but impersonal, all clean lines and quiet voices, a place where feelings did not matter. I asked for my account records, telling myself this was just to put my mind at ease. I sat while the pages printed, my hands folded in my lap. At first, the numbers meant nothing. Then I noticed one amount repeating $3,000. I saw it again a few lines later, then again. Always the same amount, always the same day of the week, always in the early afternoon. My stomach tightened as I followed the dates backward, week after week, month after month. The pattern did not change. The withdrawals lined up perfectly with my Fridays, with the hours I spent at book club believing my life was simple and safe. This was not scattered spending. It was timed. It was planned. I learned how easily it could happen. Once someone has a card and a PIN, the system assumes permission. It does not ask questions. It does not pause for doubt. It simply releases the money. When I saw confirmation that these withdrawals were made in person, at the same location, the last space for denial closed, I did not feel dramatic anger. I felt cold clarity. What I was looking at was not one bad decision or a misunderstanding. It was a routine built around my absence. I gathered the papers slowly, aware that something fundamental had shifted. The question was no longer whether something was wrong. The question was, who had allowed it, and why? I knew then that I could not stay silent any longer, and that the next step would be harder than looking at numbers on a page. I understood the cost clearly. I waited until I was sitting in my car before I called my son. I wanted my voice steady, my thoughts clear. I told myself there was still a chance this could be explained, that maybe I was missing something obvious. I listened more than I spoke, paying attention to the spaces between his answers. There were pauses that lasted just a second too long, small shifts in tone when I asked simple questions. Each hesitation felt heavier than any admission. I realized I was no longer searching for the truth. I was watching him avoid it. As the call went on, the shape of things became clear. What had started as a single request had turned into permission that was never taken back. An emergency had quietly become a routine. The money did not leave my account by accident. It left because someone decided it could. I noticed how quickly responsibility blurred, how concern softened into justification, how easily my help had been reframed as something owed. I felt a familiar instinct rise in me, the urge to smooth things over, to make room for his discomfort. That instinct faded as quickly as it came. By the time the call ended, there was no confusion left to protect me. I was not angry in the way I expected. I was focused. The hope that this was a misunderstanding slipped away, replaced by a calm acceptance of what I was hearing. I ended the call without resolving anything. I knew then that this could not be handled in fragments or over a phone line. If there was going to be honesty, It would have to happen face to face, and I understood, with a clarity that did not waver, that the next conversation would change everything. I prepared for that holiday with the same care I always had, moving through my kitchen slowly, deliberately, as if calm could be baked into the food. My hands were steady, my mind quiet, but underneath it all was a decision I had already made. When my son and his wife arrived, they brought with them the familiar rhythm of politeness and expectation. Coats were set down, food admired, and I watched how easily my space filled with their comfort. There was entitlement in small gestures, a confidence that nothing had changed. Before dinner could settle into routine, I stopped everything. I placed the bank statements on the counter and felt the room shift. I did not accuse or raise my voice. I simply laid out what I knew. I watched their faces change as denial surfaced first, then dismissal. My age became a convenient explanation, my memories something to question. The calm I carried sharpened into something clearer than anger. In that moment, I understood that respect had never been part of this equation. I felt no urge to negotiate or soften what was happening. I told them they needed to leave my home, and I meant it. The house had stopped being a place of family and became a boundary. As they gathered their things, I stayed still, aware that something irreversible had been spoken. The holiday decorations around us felt suddenly hollow, like props left behind after a performance ended. I did not follow them to the door or offer comfort. What mattered was that I had finally spoken the truth out loud. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was honest. I knew as the door closed that whatever came next would not be gentle. Still, I did not regret asking them to leave. That choice marked the end of pretending and the beginning of consequences. The line had been crossed, and there was no way back. I stood alone in my kitchen, breathing evenly, waiting for what would follow. I understood then that words were no longer enough to contain what had been unleashed. The calm had cracked, and something was about to surface. After I told them to leave, the room went still. The radio kept playing softly, completely out of place, and for a second I believed the moment had passed. I thought the worst was over. That belief lasted only a heartbeat. I moved toward the counter to steady myself, and that small motion seemed to break something. The air shifted. My son stepped forward, faster than I expected, and the space between us disappeared. There was no warning, no argument left to have. His hands hit my shoulders with force that shocked me more than the pain itself. I lost my balance. My hips struck the edge of the counter, and the floor rushed up to meet me. My head hit hard, and the world narrowed to noise and light. I tasted blood and could not catch my breath. I remember staring at the ceiling, at a stain my husband once meant to fix, thinking how unreal it felt. The worst part was not the pain, it was the clarity. In that moment, something inside me broke cleanly. This was not my child lashing out. This was a line crossed without hesitation. I understood that whatever love I thought protected us was gone. They left quickly. The door slammed, an engine started, and then there was silence. Thick, empty silence. The smell of burned food filled the room, and the smoke alarm began to chirp. I lay there alone, shaking, waiting for my body to obey me again. When it did, I dragged myself toward the phone. My hands trembled, but my mind was steady. I knew what I had to do. I called for help, not because I wanted revenge, but because I finally understood that protecting myself was no longer optional. It was the first boundary I kept. I moved through the hours after that night with surprising clarity. Paramedics came, asking careful questions, documenting what my body already knew. My wrist was wrapped, My head examined, photographs taken. Each step felt procedural, almost dull, and that steadiness helped me breathe. Later, I sat back in my living room, the same chair, the same walls, but nothing felt familiar. When I spoke to a lawyer the next morning, I listened as new words were used to describe what happened: theft, assault, elder exploitation. Those terms should have frightened me. Instead, they grounded me. They placed responsibility where it belonged. I called my financial advisor and locked everything down. Accounts frozen, PINs changed, access removed. For the first time in years, I did not ask anyone's permission to protect myself. I simply did it. I expected guilt to arrive, the old reflex that told me I was being harsh. It never came. What replaced it was resolve. I understood then that boundaries are not punishments. They are acknowledgments of reality. Choosing myself did not mean I stopped loving my son. It meant I stopped sacrificing myself to preserve an illusion. That was the moment something ended cleanly. I was no longer managing outcomes or cushioning consequences. I had done what I needed to do. From here on, the process would move forward without my interference. I did not need to chase justice or explain myself. I needed only to stand still and let truth do its work. That choice finally gave me peace I had been postponing for decades. The first call came a few days later. I recognized the pattern immediately, even before I knew the reason. The urgency was familiar. The underlying assumption that I would step in and fix what was unraveling. This time, I did not feel pulled by it. I listened long enough to understand what was being asked, and then I said no. Not angrily, not defensively, just no. More messages followed after that. Some were framed as apologies, others as explanations, most as quiet panic about bills and deadlines. I did not respond. I had already made my position clear. Any repayment or resolution would now go through the process that had been set in motion. There was nothing left to discuss privately. When no payment came, the next steps happened without drama. Paperwork moved forward. Deadlines passed. Consequences arrived exactly as they were supposed to. Without my involvement or commentary, I did not check in. I did not warn anyone. I let things unfold. There were attempts to bypass the boundaries I had set. A knock at my door one afternoon. Messages sent through other people. Each time, I chose not to engage. Silence became my most effective response. It was not coldness. It was consistency. What surprised me most was how steady I felt. Doing nothing had always frightened me before. I believed action meant love, and rescue meant responsibility. This time, restraint was the action. Letting the system work was the responsibility. As weeks passed, I observed the consequences take shape from a distance. There was no satisfaction in it, only a sense of balance returning. The situation was no longer personal. It had moved into a space where facts mattered more than feelings. And for the first time, that felt like relief rather than loss. Walking into the courtroom felt strangely ordinary. The room was quiet, structured, designed for facts rather than feelings. I took my seat without fear, noticing how detached I felt from the drama that had once consumed my thoughts. By the time it was my turn to speak, I understood that emotion no longer had a role here. I focused on details, dates, records, injuries. I spoke the way I had learned to speak after everything broke, calmly and without apology. What mattered was not how much it hurt, but what could be proven. The evidence did most of the talking. Bank statements, documentation, medical reports. They carried the truth more steadily than any raised voice ever could. When the verdict came, I did not feel victorious. There was no surge of satisfaction or relief the way stories often promise. What I felt instead was release, a loosening. The weight I had been carrying quietly for years finally set down. Recovery took time. My body healed slowly, one appointment at a time, one careful step after another. As strength returned, I began rebuilding my days around myself instead of obligation. I returned to my routines, but they felt different now. Lighter. Chosen. I planted a small garden that spring and watched it grow without interference. I signed up for a class I had always postponed. I learned who I was when I was not rescuing anyone. I accepted distance without bitterness. Some relationships end not with closure, but with clarity. As I moved forward, I realized this chapter was finished. What remained was something quieter, steadier, and finally, my own. I used to believe love meant endurance, that if I stayed quiet, kept giving, and absorbed discomfort, things would somehow stay whole. What I know now is simpler and harder. Love without respect is not love at all. Boundaries are not punishments. They are statements of reality. They tell the truth when words have been twisted too long. Consequences are not cruelty. They are clarity, and clarity is what finally allowed me to breathe. I am at peace now, not because everything ended well, but because it ended honestly. I wake up in a life that belongs to me. My days are mine to shape, my energy mine to protect. I no longer confuse being needed with being valued. If you are listening to this and carrying a quiet ache, wondering how much you are supposed to tolerate to keep the peace, I want you to know this. Choosing yourself does not make you selfish, it makes you whole. Thank you for sitting with my story and holding space for it. Sharing it has been part of my healing. If this resonated with you, I would love to hear your thoughts. What boundary would you set if you finally chose yourself? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone, and I hope my story reminds you that peace is something you are allowed to claim without guilt or fear.